Most of you know Doug from previous meetings. Gosh, I've been friends with Doug for over 40 years. So we go back all the way to Portland Road. When Nita and Doug and I all lived there, overlapped at the same time. The only philosopher who ever visited Laing's group that decided to actually jump into one of the houses and see what it was like. So that says something about Doug's daring. But Doug does us the honor every meeting of picking a topic, usually related to the theme, and doing some scholarly research on what Laing had to say about that topic. So this year, since it's Altered States, Doug's done some quite diligent research into a lot of unpublished things that Laing had written or given lectures, and so there's some real gems that you're in store for. And
he comes all the way from Australia.
He comes all the way from Australia to do this, and his delightful wife Marion comes too, so we get a double header each time. So without further ado, I'll turn over to Doug.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And I'm sure if you go to sleep during my talk about Laing and LSD, I must have really failed because quite an achievement. I want to introduce and delineate, explain Laing's expressed views and about altered realities, especially about psychedelics, and in particular LSD. I'll be mainly using published and unpublished lectures that Laing delivered at the William Allen White Institute in New York, the Psychoanalytic Institute there, exactly half a century ago, in early 1967, the Summer of Love, in fact, just before. In 1978, Mick Brown interviewed R.D. Laing for the BBC Radio Times in a piece written in relation to the Everyman series, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? That inquired into whatever happened to the hippies of 1967. Remember, this is 1978. And the title was called Acid Test. As Laing was still described as a cult hero and observer of the hippies, it is illuminating to see the contrast in how he looked back from the vantage point of 1978 on LSD and in the 60s. And Mick Brown's article reads in part, for most of the period from 1965 to 1970, he was occupied in establishing the Kingsley Hall community in London's East End, where people, Laing said, who had got into a state of confused, frantic distress, regarded as a type of illness called schizophrenia, could attempt to find a way through their predicament without psychiatric intervention, an experiment that was to have profound effects on psychiatry throughout Europe and America. It is such work in psychiatry and related fields of communication, structural anthropology and bioanthropology, little of which came under the scrutiny of the world's media, for which Laing believes the 60s will ultimately be remembered. What he calls the mediumized view of the 60s, the spiritual quests and cults, commune living, the search for realization through meditation is, Laing believes, little more than transient ephemera, which captured the mind and imagination of the moment. To quote, quoting Laing, nothing out of all that was new except the numbers involved, he says. In the history of religious cults and enthusiasm, there always seem to crop up these Adventists and Adamites. This thing of loving each other as brothers and sisters in the spirit, and with the plea to give up all personal property and positions, to abolish money and so forth. The 60s had their version of that, in the same way as the 70s have had their version of the Third Awakening in America, Laing said. As for LSD, Laing does not believe, this article continues, that its external manifestations have produced anything of lasting cultural significance. There is no piece of music, painting, poetry or sculpture that owes its existence to that experience that occurs to me as being memorable, he said. As was his wont, Laing was prone to, as you would have noticed, hyperbole. Had he forgotten the Beatles album Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, or The Doors, Jefferson Airplane or Pink Floyd? I want to note, especially given the present company, that Paul McCartney took John Lennon to the countercultural shop he was involved with, Indica Books and Gallery in London. There, Lennon came across the new book, The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead by Timothy Leary, Rolf Metzner, and Richard Alpert. Lennon read the entire book in the shop and within days presented the song to the Beatles, issued as Tomorrow Never Knows. Released in 1966, the song begins, turn off your mind, relax and float downstream. It is not dying, it is not dying. Lay down all thoughts, surrender to the void. It is shining, it is shining. Mick Brown's article concludes, the psychedelic revolution was stifled in mid-cry by the simple expedient of making LSD illegal. Quote, if it were still, this is quoting Laing, if it were still generally available, there would be a lot of people taking it, says Laing. I don't think that would change the world as the people in Haight-Ashbury believed, but it would certainly give a slightly different inflection to things. Unquote. Thus, for Laing, the 1960s would be remembered not for the summers of love, drugs and rock and roll, but for the advances in psychiatry and communications theory and their applications. During the 60s, prior to his sabbatical in India and Ceylon, Laing was mega productive in contributing his fundamental and most serious work, focusing in detail upon the implications of developments in understanding and articulating the nature of experience and communications between people, examining their contents, assumptions, ascriptions, distortions, sets, systems, and operations. He was intent on questioning the assumptions behind everything without accepting any givens to be unchallengeable. LSD was a means, a tool in this search and not an end in itself. Its use could provide opportunities in certain settings and conditions for connections with our spiritual side or the cosmos, and crucially, a method of going back behind what he called the cutoff, where we so far repressed aspects of ourselves and our history that they were unavailable and literally unrecognisable. Laing had a radical concept of who we are. He thought that Freud's division of id, ego, superego, or what can be translated from the German as it, I, and over me, did not really go far enough. Both Freud and Laing were influenced by Groddick's The Book of the It, which was published in 1923, and in The Ego and the Id, which Freud also published in 1923, he credited Groddick with the term das Es, the It. The motto of The Ego and the Id has been unfortunately too often translated as where id was, ego shall be. I think this was doing a discussion this morning actually about whether Freud said everything should be ego. And I think that that's a mistake to see Freud as saying that, because if you translate it that way, it gives the impression that therapy involves replacing the irrational id with the rational conscious ego, whereas a truer translation would imply going in the opposite direction. Where it was, there I shall be. Where it was, there I shall be. That gives the sense of a voyage of discovery into deep inner space. The self-discovery would be of the real me as the apparent it from which ourselves emanate. The it is the major ground of our being, and the apparent I or ego forms only a small part, of course an important part, but a small proportion of who we are. Laing felt that by calling our inner selves an it, that this depersonalizes us with a focus on what looks mechanistic instead of being who we are. Like Freud, Laing had a profound conviction of the unconscious running the show, but that the unconscious was still more profound and more personal than Freud proposed. Now, last year, I ended my talk with on Laing's concept of therapy with a quotation from Freud that Laing approvingly discussed, comparing neurotic struggles with the struggle in neurosis between a polar bear and a whale, which are each on different grounds or footings or levels of terrain. For Freud, neurosis occurs from the clash of a conscious wish battling an unconscious wish, which are on different psychological footings, different levels, and resolve each other into symptoms. Laing took this further. There were not only two levels, but communications theory demonstrated that there were series of meta-levels, meta-levels, and so on, not only within oneself, but in non-verbal communication between people. Repression for Laing involved not just suppression or forgetting, but the further operation of forgetting that one has forgotten, so that it is removed from consciousness, like a magic slate. Freud is very much on board thus far with his idea of the mystic writing pad, in which censorship occurs on different levels. While one hand is writing levels on it, the other is removing it, lifting the waxed page of the pad. For Laing, deeper embedded injunctions and assumptions piled together on top of one another from childhood on and in relation to perceptions and injunctions between self and others, particularly in family constellations. Moreover, cultures and societies at large are rife with habitual, taken for granted assumptions as givens, all of which result in mystifications and conclusions that may need unraveling. I want now to detail some of Lang's own history and further explain the context and philosophy that lay behind his views. Writings such as Aldous Huxley's 1954 classic The Doors of Perception of Mescaline and Stanislas Grof's 1973 book, researched from 1956 onwards in Prague through to writing at Essen, which is called Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research. Lang was obviously excited by the potential of LSD to open up realms of experience we normally deny ourselves or are denied to us. Lang himself had his first joint psychedelic mushroom dose of mescaline and LSD in 1960 at the age of 33, an age, as his son Adrian dryly notes, when most people give them up, or so they say. By 1966, Laing was fully engaged with taking LSD and other hallucinogens himself and using them with patients in Kingsley Hall and his practice at 21 Wimpole Street. At Kingsley Hall, the philosophy was to find one's true, authentic self, and LSD was seemed to be part of the way to achieve this goal. The effects of LSD mimic psychotic breakdown, and breakdown, as Laing famously said, could sometimes be broke through. LSD intrigued Laing and was given permission, and Laing was given permission by the permission of the Home Office to experiment with it therapeutically. Under the 1964 Misuse of Drugs Act, doctors were entitled to prescribe LSD. Laing told a very established medical conference in 1966, "The aim of therapy will be to enhance consciousness, not to diminish it. Drugs of choice, if any are to be used, will be predominantly consciousness-expanding drugs rather than consciousness constrictors. The psychic energizers, not the tranquilizers," unquote. Laing took small amounts of LSD with patients for 4 to 6 hour sessions with varying degrees of success. Former patients told Adrian Laing that LSD sessions could be exhilarating and liberating. Some patients found that just one session benefited them from more than years of orthodox psychoanalysis, while for others it was too much too soon. Laing recommended Sean Connery to take LSD to deal with the stress of filming Goldfinger in the early 60s. Connery had a bad trip with Laing, which was, Connery told Edgar O'Brien, a freight of terrors. Laing himself said that MDMA made him feel normal, implying that he normally felt somewhat insane. The issue of the controlled use in an appropriate setting versus the uncontrolled use of LSD was crucial. Laing often took a nuanced view of LSD and was generally more responsible about it than he was reputed to be. Not that that was such a high bar. While Laing generally did not favour the unsupervised use of powerful doses of LSD that could potentially injure patients or others, Adrian Laing observed that Lang's Wimpole Street practice gained mythological status in the 60s due to the therapeutic use of LSD. The context is important to understand. Drugs such as opium and heroin were widely used and not previously illegal in many countries around the world. LSD was legal for decades after its sole producer, Sandoz Laboratories, began marketing it in 1947. LSD was introduced into the US in 1948. During the 1950s, it was widely used, and because of its ability to imitate psychosis, its use was even encouraged among undergraduate psychology students and psychiatrists. The period from 1950 to 1965 saw dozens of books, 1,000 scientific papers, and many international conferences about LSD, and it was prescribed to 40,000 patients. This period was followed by a backlash when it became illegal in certain US states during the mid-60s. Congressional hearings led to further legislation controlling hallucinogens in the late 60s. Its illegality increased as it became more popular, especially via the counterculture. Although the 60s was the era famous for sex, drugs and rock and roll, the 50s also featured rock and roll and quite a few drugs, as I've said. Of course, sex took a great leap forward following FDA approval of the contraceptive pill in 1960 and blended in rather well with the others. And LSD was produced and distributed in extraordinary and massive quantities during the late 60s, as you'll see in the 2016 movie Orange Sunshine, Tomorrow Night. And it's also pictured in an earlier movie before 2016, just before, The Sunshine Makers. LSD was banned in California in October 1966 and banned in all states by October 68 via the Staggers-Dodd Bill. In the UK, LSD was legal during the 1960s, only becoming restricted to specific prescribers in 1973. In fact, Laing seemed to be unaware of the change in legislation when, in a routine search of his Eaton Road house following a robbery, a burglary around 1975, police found some LSD and charged Laing with illegal possession of a Class A drug under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1973. Laing managed to get off the charge on the grounds that the prosecution could not prove that the LSD was not purchased prior to 1973 when doctors were permitted to prescribe it. Mike recently told me that Laing told the initial meeting of training seminar participants for the Philadelphia Association around 1973 that there should be a minimum of 3 requirements for therapists in training. 1, to be in full psychoanalysis. 2, to read the collected works of Sigmund Freud. And 3, to sample LSD. Timothy Leary said, LSD is a drug that produces fear in people who don't take it. In fact, you may be relieved to know the 2017 Global Drug Survey concluded that psychedelic mushrooms, marijuana and LSD, yes, in that order, were relatively safe recreational drugs in terms of reporting those seeking emergency medical care over the past year. After the halcyon days of psychedelic research in the 50s, it suffered a bad trip during the 60s. But LSD research resumed, and recent research in Europe and the US has demonstrated that the therapeutic use of psychedelics, including ecstasy, LSD, and psilocybin, clearly produced positive results in the treatment of anxiety and depression. In 1964, Timothy Leary co-authored the book with Alpert and, again, Rolf Metzner, called The Psychedelic Experience, based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which I referred to before. In it, they wrote, I quote, A psychedelic experience is a journey to new realms of consciousness. The scope and context of the experience is limitless, but its characteristic features are the transcendence of verbal concepts, of space-time, dimensions, and of the ego or identity. Such experiences of enlarged consciousness can occur in a variety of ways: sensory deprivation, yoga exercises, disciplined meditation, religious or aesthetic ecstasies, or spontaneously. Most recently, they have become available to anyone through the ingestion of psychedelic drugs such as LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, etc. Of course, the drug does not produce the transcendent experience. It merely acts as a chemical key. It opens the mind, frees the nervous system of its ordinary patterns and structures, end of quote. Included in the fascinating book, Birth of a Psychedelic Culture, by Ralph Metzner and Ram Dass, is an account by Ram Dass of his encounter with Laing in London, where they took LSD together, which Ralph will, I think, be going into tomorrow. So I'm not going to discuss that. But it's interesting to note another connection between Laing and Ralph. Ralph described how he met a young woman, Jutta, in Frankfurt, with whom he had a fling. Jutta was going to London, and Ralph provided her with Laing's phone number so she could look him up. Jutta and Laing fell in love, and Jutta became Laing's second wife. And it's an amazing part of this context of the mass manufacture and distribution of LSD, or Orange Sunshine, in the late 60s with the Brotherhood of Eternal Love. It was set up at Laguna Beach and other parts of California, complete with its own spiritual high priest, Tim Leary. The Brotherhood believed that they had a spiritual mission to turn on the world. To this end, they manufactured mega millions of doses of LSD, smuggled and traded tens of thousands of kilos of hashish and marijuana. Not only the US and Canada, but the UK and Europe were in their empire. Their credibility among buyers was the highest. They saw the world as an insane asylum that they, the lunatics, needed to liberate. Just as Aldous Huxley observed about mescaline, they thought nobody would be the same after they took LSD. Thus, generations of youth could change the world if, as Leary famously put it, they would only tune in, turn on, and drop out. Laing claimed he was offered charge of the operation for the UK and Europe, but he refused. He didn't like the generic approach of turning everyone on, regardless of set or setting. LSD could be calibrated as a potent means in conjunction with a suitable guide and adapted to the individual situation and needs to be adapted to the individual situation and needs, but was scarcely a panacea in itself from Laing's point of view. To the contrary, he thought it could be dangerous. The plan to turn on Berkeley Haight-Ashbury youth with 300,000 units of LSD appalled Laing. In any event, low-cost mass doses of LSD were distributed and bought by the generation around the US, the UK and Europe, obviously particularly in this state. In case you think that Laing might have made this up, that Timothy Leary was not in on this approach, or that it was only the Brotherhood of Eternal Love that acted to spread the joy. I'll quote from the book Orange Sunshine, The Brotherhood of Eternal Love and the Quest to Spread Peace, Love and Acid in the World by Nicholas Shue. And I'll quote this. On February the 14th, 1968, Timothy Leary granted an interview to a reporter with the Long Beach Press Telegram. It was Valentine's Day, and Leary wanted the world to know that he was now dedicating his life to bringing love to the masses, one acid trip at a time. A great breakthrough in evolution is underway, a dramatic change in the way men think, the paper quoted Leary in a story that ran the next morning. Quote, we have dedicated men who manufacture LSD and other psychedelics and release them under controlled circumstances in given arenas, to see what will happen. 1 million doses were released recently in the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, the most ever released in one place at one time so far. But there are men who can release up to 10 million doses at a time. Leary, this is amazing. Leary refused to answer the reporter's questions about who was making all that LSD, and insisted that he and his unnamed accomplices were motivated purely by a desire to change the world. Quote, we're not out to amass great sums of money. We need only enough to support the work we're doing, he said. When we need it, it is there. The Lord provides. Have you heard this thing? They had a cargo plane going over, I think it was the Monterey, somebody can correct me, but I think it might have been the Monterey rock festival. Pop festival, yes. And they dropped, doses from the plane onto 25,000 participants in this festival. So, this is how Laing himself responded to these events. In Bob Mullen's interview in the book Mad to Be Normal, Laing recalls, and I quote Laing, I was absolutely appalled by it. Leary and Alpert had thought about a plan to distribute something like 300,000 acid trips within a 24-hour period to late school, college and first-year university students. Sometime after that, Alpert came over to have a chat and get my reactions to things, and he put to me, he said that they regarded Europe as my territory and Britain in particular. They would like to do this to London, what they have done in Berkeley. But, he said, we regard London and England, Scotland and Europe, but they have no real concept of Europe. They were just thinking of Chelsea as your territory. And if you say no, that's the end of it. So I said, this is Laing, I said, well, if you're asking me, well, no. They said, fine, okay. And that was an end to it. So they never carried out that operation they had done in Berkeley and San Francisco on school children and 17-year-olds of London. They said, fine, okay, and that was an end to it. I thought it was an incredible arrogance, he said, to think of themselves as some sort of world command. I mean, on unsuspecting people without telling them what they were letting themselves in for, and to missionize this. I thought it was just another symptom of the disease that they were purporting to address and to cure. If one had time to go easy on this and really working it out, it could be a really useful therapeutic agent, that's LSD. But it needed quietness and a lack of hysteria over a period of time to begin to get the hang of how this could be employed, he said. Now, however, I'm saying that, I suspect that the Brotherhood of Eternal Love simply gave up on him, bypassed him, and moved on to other distributors. The extent of their deep reach across and within nations could not be clearer when you view that extraordinary documentary tomorrow. It's quite stunning. This Orange Sunshine is based on interviews with leading members of the Brotherhood. At the very least, they had a quasi-religious mission to fulfil. Laing contacted the British Home Office and spoke with Scotland Yard about it all to no avail. Laing was on a serious quest to understand the human world. Clearly, he also loved to have fun. For decades, he was no stranger to alcohol, nor from the age of 33 in 1960, as I said, to drugs. Psychedelic drugs, particularly mescaline and LSD, were for him means of both enjoyment and enlightenment of himself and others. But his use of them with others, whether at Kingsley Hall or in his practice in Wimpole Street, was primarily as a therapeutic and aid together with being a research aid for opening up experience. At that time, the experience of a metanoic voyage was seen as desirable, even essential, as part of Kingsley Hall, and more widely. The term metanoia is Greek for repentance, but literally means change of mind. As you would imagine, the term paranoia means beside mind, nous. Metanoia involves a transformative change of mind, as in repentance. Like love, as Andrew Lloyd Webber might have said, it changes everything, including behaviour, change of heart, even conversion. In a lecture titled Metanoia, published in Recherche, in the French journal, in 1968, Laing proposed two hypotheses. One, schizophreniform breakdown may be a resource called upon when all else seems impossible. And two, if the set and setting can be changed, the experience may be so transformed that it may no longer seem to be regarded as psychotic. Now, LSD was originally regarded as a psychotomimetic substance, that is, producing in the mind effects similar to psychosis. Laing saw it as having a natural analogue in a metanoic voyage. The nature of this voyage was dependent on the set and setting. Mental hospitals define that voyage as madness per se and treat it accordingly. According to Laing, the setting of a psychiatric clinic promotes in staff and patients the set best designed to turn the metanoic voyage from a voyage of discovery into the self as of a potentially revolutionary and liberating nature into what he called a catastrophe, into a pathological process from which the person requires to be cured. I want to quote from what Laing told his audience in the William Allinson White lectures in 1967. In the New Testament, Laing now says, repentance or paranoia, change of mind, was related to what was called baptism. John the Baptist baptizing people in the water and saying that someone would come greater than him, who were baptized people not only in water but in fire and in air. Baptism means apparently something like an inversion, a cleansing, a sort of death prior to a rebirth. Both repentance and baptism closely interwoven into that sequence of returning to the womb and being born again, and thereby changing from the old man to the new man. Metanoia is a term that would simply mean a change of mind of this particular time, of going into meta-experiential realms, all domains of experience beyond our cut-off from them, going to a variable distance to these meta-regions of experience, and eventually returning the experience of the return to as a natural experience, frequently of a sort of rebirth. A metanoid voyage or process would entail some measure of initiation into those regions of potential experience, or of our mind, or of what is of being, which is beyond our normal range, without any presupposition on our part in using such a term that there's anything at all pathological about this, but rather that the state of engulfment in the body of our own death, whereby we're asleep and don't know that we're asleep, so forgetful that we can't even remember that we've forgotten, so ignorant that we don't even know that we don't know. That is the condition that this process, fundamentally speaking, has the function of awakening us from. That's metanoia. In his paper to the first International Rochester Conference on the Origins of Schizophrenia in March 1967, same year, Laing says, the metanoic sequence lends itself to the metaphor of a voyage inwards and backwards until it reaches a turning point, and the voyager returns through an accelerated neogenesis, forwards once more and outwards into the world without loss of self. It appears to be a sort of death-rebirth experience from which, if successfully negotiated, the person returns to the world feeling newborn, refreshed and reintegrated at a higher level of functioning than before. Laing thought that there was a taboo on moving backwards, but it was often a precondition for moving forwards. Thus, a voyage was then going backwards in order to go forwards. Regression was a precondition of progression. Regression was a term Freud used for a return to a more primitive point, a reversion to past phases of development, both temporally and structurally. This leads us to the heart of what I think lay behind Laing's interest in LSD for the therapeutic process. For Laing, the place of LSD in therapy was that of a chemical enabler. It provided the opportunity to produce regression and reversion to earlier experiences that were unconscious, many of which were made unconscious through various operations, both that others had induced and we induced upon ourselves. This was especially so for the experiences that we forget, but those that we forget that we have forgotten, the levels of the system that gave us the illusion that what we now remember or experience is all that exists, and that there are no realms, this idea that there are no realms that we have forgotten because we have forgotten that we have forgotten. At last year's conference at Esalen, I discussed Laing's view of therapy as centering upon mystification. Mystification involved something akin to a hypnotic suggestion or a spell a spell that was cast that needed to be revealed and then, if possible, countermanded, counter-suggested. In line with Laing's theory about hypnotic suggestion and the spells or unconscious injunctions that are wrought on us or by us, could it be that LSD or the psychedelics could take us back behind the original suggestion so that the slate is wiped clean and a new suggestion, counter-suggestion, or no suggestion can be made to the extent that we are hard programmed. Perhaps psychedelics can help us to have a reset, or to get carried away with the analogy, perhaps even perform a reboot or a reconfiguration to factory settings. Laing discussed some of these issues about operations and our being hard programmed in his white lectures. Therapy could involve going back through levels of reality that constructed a person's present psychic world, making the current consensual version of reality seem a self-evident, unchallengeable given after we have forgotten that we've forgotten. LSD could pierce through and behind these barriers of illusory givens to see them in context as constructions. Once they are seen as constructions, the constructions they are, there are therefore alternative scenarios that a person can then choose or understand why they haven't taken them. As Laing told Bob Mullen in Mad to Be Normal, was there a possibility that acid could release someone from being caught in the hell world and allow a movement to occur which they might, in the presence of other people, move themselves back into a balanced, sane world if they've ever been in it before? Laing says, in order to get back to a state of unintegration, a person has to frequently regress in time. The most frequently missed function of regression is to undergo a method of undoing repression. For Laing, human intention and meaning are always part of the behaviour of a person or persons. Thus, we can explain human behaviour in personal existential terms. That is fine for conscious behaviour. It's also understandable for preconscious and even levels of unconscious behaviour that Freud revealed initially in his dream theory, and then, of course, in the psychopathology of everyday life, and theories of anxiety and neurosis. We don't know how much we don't know. Freud began to understand the operations of human intentions on ourselves and others. He was a hero of the voyages into the underworld, as Laing wrote in The Divided Self. I believe Laing's overall or global project, as Jean-Paul Sartre might have called it, was to begin to provide a thoroughgoing personal account of experience and behaviour in human terms, so that that involved challenging givens at every stage. Mad behaviour and actions might make some sense. Laing strongly rejected, as we know, Karl Jasper's conviction that psychosis was a barrier and is ununderstandable, believing that psychosis was far more understandable than was often assumed, and might sometimes provide a further pathway, perhaps a break in the wall, to understanding human being in general. Trying to understand psychosis, Laing increasingly tried to lay bare the operators or operations on experience, both by self and by others, and to understand the interweaving of these operations inside, between, or beside ourselves. So that meant bracketing out or challenging taking for granted basic assumptions or givens. These operations on experience include repression, identification, projection, introjection, denial, regression, and splitting. On a direct horizontal level, Laing examined self-other and family or group interactions that define our realities using theories such as Gregory Bateson's double bind theory and Sartre's theories about series and nexus. But there are also the vertical and deeper historical experiential operations beneath and levels of awareness at many levels that deny each other and interweave. So, Laing questions reality at every level and sees LSD as a means of fast-tracking regression and insight, as it were, cutting out the resistant middleman. Laing owed a tremendous debt to Freud and took the spirit of his writings very seriously. Freud revealed some levels of cut-offs and also the operations of experience. For Freud, for Freud, the unconscious world whose content is representative of the drives is governed by a primary process, especially by condensation and displacement. Our consciousness is a small part of who we are, for Freud, who took on Groddick's theory, his theory of das Es, which we said. Laing believes that the it went still deeper, seeming to be alien and controlling us, but in fact it's central part of us that we need to make our own in a consistently personal psychology. As Laing put it in his White Lectures, it's only from a remarkably socially relative position of alienation that our essential true selves we take to be the id. The id is us. It's the id that's doing it all. Despite us, it's not the it. It's precisely who we are. It's because we pitched out to ourselves that we talk about the small fragment of our total being as our ego and our fundamental being as though it were something else. Many people even doubt that we have ourselves. By the time we've lost ourselves so completely as that, we're so depersonalised that we don't even know that we're depersonalised, he said. The cut-offs or barriers that we don't see in ourselves are important, if only because they don't appear to exist. But this is illusory, even if many people in our current society don't question it. Laing was fond of saying that when viewed through history and cultural anthropology about the status of the normal, very few outside the current generation would think of our current scene as normal. If we look horizontally across all cultures and vertically back 4 or 5 generations, Laing says, there might be no one, he says, there might be no one who sees what's going on. If anyone comes through with a statement about what is going on, they are in very considerable jeopardy. There's very little relationship in this whole world between what is going on and what people say is going on. So, reality in normal or altered, as Laing would often say, is always up for grabs. No, that's it.